Are you the architect of your own ruins? Have you ever stood in the wreckage of another opportunity you destroyed, another relationship you poisoned, another morning you wasted, and wondered why? Why this pattern repeats itself with such cruel precision that it can no longer be called coincidence or bad luck? You're so close to something beautiful, success within reach, love offering itself openly, peace settling around you like a gentle fog, and then, as if possessed, you strike the match yourself. You sabotage what you most deeply want. You run from what you've been chasing, you break what you've been building. And in the aftermath, standing among the familiar debris, you promise yourself, never again. Yet here you are, reading these words, recognizing yourself in them, feeling that ache of recognition. The cycle continues. This is not a video about motivation. This is not about working harder or wanting more. This is about the war within you, the civil war between who you believe you are and who you could become. Because the most devastating form of self-sabotage isn't laziness or procrastination or impulsivity, it's identity. It's the story you keep telling yourself about who you are. The ancient Stoics understood this battle centuries ago. Epictetus, born a slave who later became one of history's most profound philosophers, wrote, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." Not the other way around. Identity first, then action. But what happens when the identity you've constructed becomes the very prison preventing your escape? That's the room we're entering now. A room where we examine the narratives that have become your cage. Where we question whether the story you've been telling yourself about why you fail, why you hurt, why you run, why you hide, is actually protecting you or destroying you. Look closer at your patterns. What if they aren't failures of willpower, but perfect successes of identity protection? What if each act of self-sabotage is actually your psyche's desperate attempt to keep you safely within the boundaries of who you believe you are? The question isn't why you keep failing. The question is, who would you become if you succeeded? And why does that person terrify you? You've constructed a narrative about yourself. We all have. Piece by piece, interpretation by interpretation, memory by memory. I'm the kind of person who... I've always been... I could never. These aren't observations. They're sentences, both descriptions and punishments. This narrative didn't appear from nowhere. It was written in the margins of childhood disappointments, in the subtext of others' expectations, in the aftermath of your earliest failures and victories. And now it operates like a hidden program, running silently in the background of your consciousness, making decisions before you're even aware there's a choice to be made. Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius understood this when he wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." Your identity, that deep sense of who you are, has been dyed with thousands of thoughts, beliefs, and interpretations. Some served you once, many no longer do, yet they dictate your every move. Think about the last time you sabotaged something important. Perhaps you picked a fight before an important event, procrastinated until failure was inevitable, said the one thing you knew would burn the bridge, abandoned a promising path just as it began to bear fruit, numbed yourself precisely when clarity was most needed. In that moment, did it feel like a choice? Or did it feel inevitable, almost like watching yourself from outside, knowing what was coming but powerless to stop it? That wasn't weakness, that was identity protection. Because succeeding, advancing, connecting, or growing would have pushed you beyond the boundaries of who you believe you are. And no force is more terrifying to the human psyche than identity dissolution. The fear that I might disappear if circumstances change too dramatically. The ancient Stoics recognized this trap. Seneca wrote, "It is not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It is because we do not dare that things are difficult." Your perception of difficulty, what feels impossible or overwhelming, is directly tied to who you believe you are capable of being. When was the first time you decided you weren't capable? When did you first interpret a failure not as an event, but as evidence of your inherent nature? When was the first time you thought, "This is just how I am"? That moment, perhaps forgotten consciously, but remembered by your nervous system, your patterns, your reflexive behaviors, was when identity became destiny, when a thought about yourself calcified into a prison. Self-sabotage is not a character flaw. It's a protection mechanism. It's your psyche's desperate attempt to maintain coherence, to keep you safely within the boundaries of your established identity. This is why willpower fails. This is why motivation fades. This is why knowledge alone doesn't transform. Because you cannot consistently act in ways that contradict who you deeply believe you are. Your actions will always align themselves with your identity, even if that alignment destroys what you consciously want. The Roman Stoic teacher Epictetus understood this paradox when he observed, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Freedom doesn't come from external circumstances. It comes from internal mastery. Specifically, mastery over the narratives that define you. Consider the person who self-sabotages romantic relationships. On the surface, they want connection, love, partnership. But deeper than that conscious want is an identity narrative. I am unworthy of love, or people always leave, or I am fundamentally unlovable. When a loving partner appears, offering everything they consciously want, the dissonance becomes unbearable. Their actions, cheating, picking fights, becoming cold, finding flaws, aren't failures. They're successes, perfect executions of identity protection, because being loved would contradict who they believe they are. Or the person who undermines career advancement. They say they want success, recognition, achievement. But their identity narrative whispers, you don't belong at that level, or success leads to abandonment, or ambition is selfish. So they miss deadlines on critical projects. They speak impulsively in important meetings. They fail to prepare for the presentation, not because they're incapable, but because succeeding would thrust them into identity crisis. Better to remain the person you believe you are, even if that person suffers, than to dissolve into the unknown. What identity are you protecting with your patterns of self-sabotage? What story about yourself feels so fundamental that your unconscious would rather destroy your conscious desires than let that story be contradicted? This isn't just psychological theory. The Stoics intuited this centuries ago. Marcus Aurelius advised himself, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment. Your estimate of yourself, that tightly held identity, can be revoked. It can be rewritten. It can be transformed. But first, you must see it clearly. You must recognize the narrative that has become both your foundation and your cage. The most insidious aspect of your self-sabotaging identity is that it feels like truth. It doesn't present itself as a story I'm telling about myself. It presents itself as reality, as observation, as immutable fact. This is just who I am. But what if it isn't? What if who you are is not a fixed state but a fluid, evolving process? What if identity itself is not a noun but a verb, not a finished product, but an ongoing creation? The Stoic philosophers embraced this perspective. Seneca wrote, "Difficulties strengthen the mind, as labor does the body." Just as physical strength is developed through resistance, identity can be reshaped through challenging experiences. The person you believe you are is not carved in stone, it's written in sand, constantly subject to revision. Yet most people treat their identities as absolute truth, defending them at all costs, even if that defense means sabotaging relationships, opportunities, health, or growth. We would rather remain consistent with our flawed self-concept than allow success to redefine us. Why? Because identity dissolution feels like death. To let go of who you believe you are, even if that belief causes suffering, triggers existential terror. Who would you be if not the person you've always been? What would remain if your familiar self-concept disappeared? This is where the Stoics offer profound guidance. Epictetus taught, make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. You cannot control the initial narrative given to you by circumstances, caretakers, or early experiences, but you possess absolute power over its interpretation and continuation. You can revise the story. Think of the person who believes, I always quit when things get hard. This identity, this habitual self-description, will generate predictable patterns of behavior, abandoning projects, relationships, and opportunities when the initial enthusiasm fades and real effort begins. But what if they considered an alternative interpretation? What if the same pattern was viewed not as evidence of an inherent flaw, but as a learned response to discomfort? Not, I always quit, but I've developed a habit of withdrawing when facing uncertainty, a habit I can unlearn. Same behavior, different identity interpretation, and that difference changes everything. Or consider the person who believes, I'm terrible with money. This identity creates a predictable relationship with finances, overspending, under-earning, avoiding financial reality, self-sabotaging when resources grow. But what if they reframed this not as an inherent quality, but as an undeveloped skill? Not, I'm terrible with money, but I haven't yet learned effective financial management, but I can begin now. The ancient Stoics would recognize this as the practice of prohairesis, the capacity to choose how we interpret and respond to our circumstances, including our own patterns. What self-sabotaging identity do you currently hold as truth? What story about yourself feels so fundamental that you'd rather fail than contradict it? And most importantly, how might you reinterpret that same evidence in a way that allows growth rather than repetition? The mind craves coherence above all else. When your actions contradict your identity, mental discomfort, cognitive dissonance arises. And your mind will resolve this discomfort in one of two ways. Either your identity must shift to accommodate new actions, or your actions must regress to align with your existing identity. Self-sabotage is the latter solution. It relieves the discomfort of becoming someone you don't recognize by pulling you back into familiar territory, even if that territory is painful. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus captured this when he said, "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." As long as you believe you already know who you are, as long as your identity feels fixed and absolute, transformation remains impossible. You cannot become what you cannot conceive. This explains why sudden success or improvement often triggers self-destruction. The lottery winner who squanders millions, the relationship phobe who finds fault with a perfect partner, the dieter who binges after significant progress. These aren't failures of character. They're the mind's desperate attempts to resolve contradiction between new circumstances and established identity. "This isn't me" becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But what if the solution isn't trying harder within the same identity framework? What if the solution is rewriting the identity itself? The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, journaling to himself in what would later be published as Meditations, wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." If identity stands in your way, then identity transformation becomes the way forward. Not battling against your current self-concept, but deliberately evolving it. This isn't simple positive thinking or affirmations. It's methodical identity reconstruction, something the Stoics practiced through disciplined self-dialogue and philosophical reflection. They understood that to change behavior permanently, you must change who you believe you are at the most fundamental level. Consider how differently you would act if you truly believed, "I am someone who follows through, especially when things get difficult. I naturally create abundance in all areas of my life. I am worthy of love and capable of healthy attachment. I belong in positions of influence and leadership. I honor commitments to myself with the same seriousness as promises to others." These aren't magical incantations. They're alternative identity narratives, stories about yourself that could become just as true as the limiting ones you currently hold, if you were willing to reinforce them through consistent interpretation and action. When was the last time you questioned your fundamental assumptions about who you are? When did you last consider that your most deeply held identity beliefs might be outdated interpretations rather than absolute truths? What if the person you believe you are, the person who self-sabotages, is nothing more than a story you keep telling yourself? And what if you could tell a different story? Identity revision isn't abstract philosophy. It's practical psychology with ancient wisdom behind it. The Stoics developed specific practices for reshaping self-concept, many of which align remarkably well with modern cognitive approaches to lasting behavior change. First, They practiced contemplation of the sage, visualization of the ideal self. Seneca advised, "We need to set our affections on some good man and keep him constantly before our eyes, so that we may live as if he were watching us and do everything as if he saw what we were doing." This isn't fantasy, it's identity rehearsal. By vividly imagining yourself as the person you could become, you create a cognitive template, a proto-identity, that can begin to compete with your current self-concept. Who would you be if self-sabotage wasn't part of your pattern? How would that version of you think? What would they believe? How would they interpret the same events you're experiencing now? Inhabit that perspective, even briefly, and you initiate identity revision. Second, the Stoics practiced premeditatio malorum, premeditation of adversity. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly." This wasn't pessimism. It was preparation mental rehearsal for maintaining philosophy under pressure. In terms of identity change, this means anticipating the moments your new self-concept will be challenged and preparing specific responses. If you're revising an identity from "I always quit" to "I persist through difficulty," then prepare for the moment persistence feels impossible. What will you tell yourself? How will you interpret the urge to quit? How will you respond when your old identity narrative resurfaces in moments of stress? Third, the Stoics practiced the view from above, gaining perspective by imagining events from a cosmic viewpoint. This practice dissolves the rigid boundaries of identity by expanding awareness beyond the individual self. From this expanded perspective, how important is the story you've been telling about yourself? How permanent is this identity you've constructed? How much of it is arbitrary interpretation rather than objective reality? These aren't simply philosophical exercises, they're practical tools for loosening the grip of a self-sabotaging identity, because you cannot consistently act in ways that contradict who you believe you are. Identity revision must precede lasting behavior change. Consider the research of psychologist Kelly McGonigal, who found that people who believe willpower is a limited resource exhaust their willpower more quickly than those who view it as abundant. Same challenge, different identity belief, dramatically different outcome. Or studies showing that students who are taught to view intelligence as malleable, growth mindset, rather than fixed, perform better and persist longer than those who believe ability is innate. Same student, different identity narrative, transformed results. Your self-sabotage isn't a mysterious curse. It's the logical outcome of your current identity beliefs colliding with your conscious desires. When your deepest self-concept contradicts your stated goals, identity will win every time. But identity itself can change. It must change if your patterns of self-destruction are to be broken. What identity revision would disarm your particular form of self-sabotage? What alternative narrative about yourself would make success feel like the natural expression of who you are, rather than a threat to your sense of self? The most powerful identity revisions don't reject your existing narrative entirely. They reinterpret it. They find the thread of truth in your current self-concept and reweave it into a more empowering pattern. This is what the Stoics meant by living in accordance with nature, not fighting against reality, including the reality of your own tendencies, but channeling those tendencies toward virtue and flourishing. If you believe I'm too sensitive, perhaps the reinterpretation isn't I'm tough and unfeeling, a complete contradiction unlikely to take root, but rather, my sensitivity gives me exceptional perception when I direct it purposefully. If you believe I'm undisciplined, perhaps the reframing isn't I have iron self-control, but I channel my spontaneous nature toward what truly matters to me. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who lived much of his life as a slave before gaining freedom, understood this principle of working with, rather than against, natural tendencies. Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. Your existing self-concept wasn't created arbitrarily. It emerged from genuine experiences, observations, and feedback. To dismiss it entirely would be to dismiss part of your lived reality. The art is finding the constructive core within even your most self-limiting beliefs. Consider the acclaimed novelist who revealed he finishes his books because I'm too afraid not to. He doesn't deny his anxious nature, he channels it. His fear of failure, rather than driving self-sabotage, fuels completion. Or the entrepreneur who described herself as too obsessive to work for someone else. She didn't overcome her obsessive tendencies. She redirected them from being liabilities to becoming assets in a context where deep focus and attention to detail create value. Even Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, practiced this form of identity reinterpretation in his private journals. Rather than denying his irritation with others, he wrote, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly." He acknowledged his judgmental nature but redirected it toward philosophical preparation rather than reactive frustration. What elements of your current self-concept, even the limiting elements, contain a kernel of truth that could be redirected rather than rejected? How might your very tendencies toward self-sabotage carry within them the seeds of your greatest strengths, if channeled differently? This isn't about positive thinking, it's about accurate thinking. Seeing yourself fully, including both limitations and capacities, and crafting an identity narrative that accounts for both while directing you toward growth rather than repetition. Because identity is both the source of your self-sabotage and the key to its dissolution. Change who you believe you are, and you change everything. For identity revision to take root, it must be not only conceived but reinforced. New self-concepts remain fragile until supported by experience, interpretation, and community. This is where Stoic practice becomes essential. First, create evidence. The Stoics were not merely philosophers but practitioners. Epictetus taught, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." Each small action aligned with your new identity creates evidence for its reality. Each time you act as if your revised self-concept were already true, you strengthen its foundation. If you're revising an identity from "I'm disorganized" to "I create effective systems," then organize one small space, not your entire life, just a drawer, a digital folder, a morning routine. This isn't about perfection, it's about evidence creation. Each organized space becomes proof of your revised identity, gradually outweighing the evidence supporting your old self-concept. Second, reinterpret history. Your current identity isn't just supported by present behavior, it's reinforced by your interpretation of past experiences. The Stoics practiced this through reflective writing, examining events not as absolute truths, but as material for philosophical interpretation. Marcus Aurelius demonstrated this when he wrote, "Choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed, and you haven't been." He wasn't denying reality, but recognizing the role of interpretation in experience. Look back on the events that shaped your self-sabotaging identity. How else might they be interpreted? What strengths, capacities, or values might those same experiences have developed in you? How might your current struggles be reframed as evidence of potential rather than limitation? The person who believes "I'm a failure" can examine the same evidence and potentially conclude, "I've attempted difficult things that matter to me, learning crucial lessons with each iteration." Third, find your community. Identity is social. It's reinforced or undermined by those we allow into our inner circle. Seneca emphasized this when he wrote, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you. Welcome those whom you're capable of improving." The process is a mutual one. Men learn as they teach. Who in your life reinforces your limiting identity? Who consistently interprets your behavior in ways that lock you into patterns of self-sabotage? And more importantly, who sees you as you could be rather than merely as you have been? Surround yourself with those who naturally perceive and relate to your revised identity. People who will reflect back to you not just your past patterns, but your emerging potential. Their perception becomes a mirror in which you can begin to recognize your changing self. This three-part process, creating evidence, reinterpreting history, and finding community, transforms identity revision from an intellectual exercise into lived experience. The new narrative begins to feel not like aspiration, but like truth, not who you want to be, but who you are. And as your identity shifts, your self-sabotage loses its purpose. Those destructive patterns emerge to protect an identity you no longer fully inhabit. They were security measures for a self that is evolving beyond them. What small piece of evidence could you create today that would support your revised identity? What past experience might you reinterpret through the lens of this new self-concept? And who in your life already sees in you what you're working to become? There will be resistance. Identity change feels like small deaths. The dissolution of who you've been, making space for who you might become. Your mind will fight this dissolution, returning to familiar self-concepts even as you work to revise them. The ancient Stoics recognized this internal battle. Epictetus taught his students, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid with regard to external things. Growth requires accepting temporary dissonance, the uncomfortable gap between your emerging identity and your established patterns. When you begin to act from your revised self-concept, when you persist where you would have quit, when you speak where you would have remained silent, when you connect where you would have withdrawn, it will feel false at first. Imposter syndrome is the tax paid for identity expansion. This discomfort is not evidence that your identity revision is failing. It's evidence that it's working, that you're pushing beyond the boundaries of your previous self-concept into new territory. The Stoics had a practice for this discomfort. Amor fati, the love of fate. Marcus Aurelius expressed it when he wrote, accept the things to which fate binds you and love the people with whom fate brings you together, but do so with all your heart. Applied to identity revision, this means embracing the discomfort of growth rather than resisting it. Loving the process of becoming with all its uncertainty and contradiction. Accepting that the path from self-sabotage to self-actualization passes directly through the territory of self-doubt. Because identity revision isn't about reaching a perfect final state. It's about creating a self-concept fluid enough to evolve with your growth, resilient enough to incorporate failures without defining you by them, and expansive enough to accommodate your full potential. The self-sabotaging patterns you've been battling aren't character defects. They're the shadows cast by an identity too small to contain who you're capable of becoming. They're the friction created when your conscious desires collide with your unconscious self-concept. The solution isn't trying harder within the same identity framework. It's expanding the framework itself. Who would you be if you weren't defined by your patterns of self-sabotage? What would become possible if your identity expanded to include not just who you've been, but who you're becoming? How would you move through the world if your self-concept was characterized by growth rather than limitation? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're invitations to the most fundamental form of creation, the creation of self. Not through force or positive thinking or temporary motivation, but through the methodical revision of who you believe you are. Because the Stoics were right. We become what we repeatedly think. The soul is dyed by the color of its thoughts. And your thoughts about yourself, your identity narrative, determine everything. If this conversation has touched something in you, if some part of this exploration has illuminated a pattern you're ready to transform, then carry this forward. Not as information, but as practice. Begin the process of identity revision. Not all at once, but deliberately, consistently, with patience for the discomfort it will inevitably produce. Because the discomfort of growth, while intense, is temporary. The discomfort of remaining trapped in patterns of self-sabotage is chronic. The most fundamental form of self-mastery isn't controlling your actions. It's authoring your identity, consciously crafting the story you tell about who you are and what's possible for you. As Epictetus taught, first say to yourself what you would be and then do what you have to do. Identity first, then action. Vision, then embodiment. The patterns that have defined you need not confine you. The story you've been living is not the only story you could tell. The identity that has driven your self-sabotage is not your only possible self. You are both the author and the protagonist of your life's narrative. The pen is in your hand. The page turns, a new chapter begins. If something within this room has awakened a recognition in you, leave a trace of yourself in the comments below. Not as a favor to an algorithm, but as a marker on your path of transformation. Write the first line of your revised identity, the self-concept that would make self-sabotage not just unnecessary but impossible. Share the insight in the comments that illuminated your particular pattern. Name the interpretation you're ready to release, and the one with which you'll replace it. Because identity revision, while deeply personal, gains power when witnessed, when your emerging self-concept is reflected back to you through the recognition of others walking a similar path. This is not the end of your story. It's a deliberate revision. The moment you begin to write yourself not as you've been, but as you choose to become.